Hello, everybody, and welcome. We're delighted you're spending an hour of your afternoon with us today to talk about how PTE 2020-02's retrospective review requirements intersects with your regulatory compliance priorities, technology, and growth opportunities as well. A few quick housekeeping matters before we get started. We are recording today's conversation and plan to share it with you along with the slides. We appreciate your time and welcome any and all questions throughout today's session. Please use the chat box at the end of at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions that you may have throughout today's conversation. And as with many of you, some of us are working from our home offices, so you may hear some background noise I guess in the background. And we appreciate your understanding. Okay, to get us started, I'm going to ask our esteemed panelists to introduce themselves. May I begin with you, Craig?
Thank you, Param. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I'm Craig Watanabe. I'm the Director of IA Compliance with DFPG Investments. We're a small dual registrant headquartered out of Salt Lake City, but I am located in Los Angeles.
David?
Thank you, Param. My name is David Porteous. I'm a partner at Faegre Drinker in the Chicago office. I work in both business litigation and investment management. I work primarily with brokerage firms and investment advisors on regulatory compliance, enforcement, and examinations.
Thank you, Ed.
Thanks, Param. I'm Ed Wegener, and I am a managing director for Oyster Consulting, and I also head up their governance, risk, and compliance practice. We deal with primarily with broker-dealers and investment advisors. I've been with Oyster since July of 2020. Prior to that, I was with FINRA for 22 years, so I spent most of my career as a regulator and hope to bring that former regulator perspective to today's panel.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ed. And we have another panelist who's technically in the Zoom waiting room. He'll be joining us in a quick second. His name is Mitchell Powell, and he's a partner with Katten. I will ask him to introduce himself once he's able to join and give you a little bit more of a background on himself. In the meantime, my name is Param Nasseri, and I'm the head of product and regulatory strategy at InvestorCOM. If you haven't heard of us, we're a leading regulatory software provider in the wealth management sector across North America, and our award-winning and intuitive design has helped clients across North America for the past 30 years as of yesterday. Okay, folks, let's begin. What we want to talk about today is a discussion surrounding this multifaceted topic of PTE 2020-02, rollover recommendations, and the retrospective review process. We'll begin with an overview. We'll dive into the challenges and opportunities presented by a whole slew of pre-trade or pre-execution requirements through SEC's requirements, as well as the Department of Labor's, and as well as correlating between Department of Labor's requirements and the SEC. And as always, we've allotted plenty of time at the end of today's session to address any questions you may have throughout today's conversation. Please engage and allow us to dynamically correspond on whatever that is topical on your mind. So over the course of the PTE 2020-02 journey, and even going back to the SEC's Reg BI journey, we've been bringing the wealth and compliance communities together to better understand how you and your peers are tackling the requirements. As part of this, prior to every webinar, with the captive audience as large as today's, we ask a series of poll questions to get a pulse on the industry's assessment of how they're meeting the specific requirements. And so to begin, we asked about what you're finding most challenging, and observed that when compared to similar poll results going back to all the way back to March, assessing plan fees and assessing plan fees used to be the most challenging requirement, and now, as you can see on screen, the specific retrospective review requirements tend to be the biggest challenge for the poll respondents specifically. We also asked whether you're taking a manual or technology-based approach to meeting the recommendations, whether it's a product or rollover recommendations. And as you can see, there's a little bit of a trend, not necessarily in our favor, but this data kind of switches as we go throughout today's presentation. So less and less folks are adopting technology as it appears, slightly less, between 40 to 36%, and more are going towards the paper-based or manual-based PDF and Excel-based analysis. I'll quickly pause here. Mr. Mitchell, do you mind doing a quick background on yourself before we move forward?
Sure. Can you hear me now?
Excellent. Yes, sir.
Okay, sure. So my name is Mitch Paul. I'm a partner at Katten, Rosenman in the New York office. My specialty is executive compensation, employee benefits, and like most of the other, like all the other panelists, I'm in the fund investment space and involved with IRAs, 401ks, and all sorts of stuff like that.
Thank you very much, Mitchell, and welcome. So just continuing on to our poll results, why are folks not adopting technology was also a central question to this. And really, there's a consistent trend, as you can see, more and more folks are responding that they are adopting technology, which is certainly a positive, and we feel that we're sort of meeting our purpose in the industry. But as you can see on sort of the middle column here, vast majority of folks are indicating that limitation of time and resources tends to be the biggest challenge or the biggest reason why they are not adopting technology. Finally, we asked, how do you plan to meet the retrospective review requirements, the hot topic, or the topic that's on the agenda in almost every one of our conversations? And as you can see, how do you plan to meet the retrospective review requirements? Craig, this is going to go very much in contango with the data points that the article, as well as the templates that you shared with us. A lot of folks tackling it via a sampling methodology. Others are reviewing every single rollover recommendation, and others have taken or have indicated that they will be taking a risk-based framework to the rollover requirements. Folks, we appreciate your time in responding to these poll questions, and we certainly hope that you found insight in how you and your peers are tackling the specific PTE requirements. Now, let's jump into the meat of the conversation. And Mr. Porteous, maybe I can start with you. Would you mind sharing with our audience, rollovers have been under scrutiny for some time, starting from state regulators all the way to FINRA and the SEC, and now the Department of Labor's. What's the general driver in your respective view around why these rollovers are under immense scrutiny?
I think the fundamental issue is the economics of the decision being made, and the regulators recognizing both, the regulators across the spectrum, as you just indicated, looking at that this is a seminal investment decision to be made if you are indeed rolling out of a plan. So for a broker dealer or an investment advisor looking to capture qualified money coming from a plan or from another IRA and saying, hey, this is an important decision that people need to understand the fees and costs associated with it. So that's what I mean in terms of the focus on the economics of it. And so therefore, this is as important as an investment decision that is going to be made as it would be if you have a transaction, a specific security or something like that that might be being recommended down the road. So by moving the trigger for a best interest or fiduciary analysis to what are the circumstances in which you're making a recommendation? Are you making a recommendation when you tell people what their options are, specifically tailored to them, in terms of, hey, whether it's a good idea to move out of a plan and into an IRA or the like, then that's an important decision that needs to be taken as equally seriously by the firms, and embracing that they have an obligation to do this with best interest of the investor in mind. And so that's the driver of the analysis across the spectrum of this has serious economic consequences, particularly rolling out of a plan can't be undone. So
thanks, Dave. Maybe Ed, maybe we can get your perspective as someone who's led many functions at FINRA. You've likely seen this all before, policies and new requirements being put into place for firms, and many firms kind of rushing to comply With the February PTE 2020-02 retrospective review requirement ahead of us, what do you think regulators will be looking to do post the deadline?
Sure. Thanks, Pam. I think my experience has been that typically when regulators create new and significant rules, generally, and I mean generally, they tend to understand that there's going to be a learning period, and their expectations, for what they expect early on, take that into consideration. And as a result, they tend not to be super aggressive early on, provided that they see good faith efforts to comply. And it's very similar to the approach that the SEC and FINRA took when they initially started to review for regulation best interest. In that case, they announced that they were going to start out looking for good faith compliance, and were focused primarily on ensuring that firms had adequate policies and procedures in place, that they were making a good faith effort to comply. Where they saw issues or foot faults or things, they let the firms know, and with the expectation that they would take corrective action and improve their programs. Then they gradually shifted their focus to focusing more on disclosures, whether the disclosures were adequate, whether they were done timely. And then in 2022, they began looking more substantively and conducting specific reviews around the care obligation. And so the reviews got more in-depth, and they really started to get under the hood in terms of what they were looking at and what their expectations were. And now you're starting to see some of the initial enforcement actions come out of it. And so generally, I would anticipate that the DOL would take a similar approach with respect to the PTE. So in that regard, what I'd really suggest that firms do is to make sure that they have a well thought out set of policies and procedures, that they have a good process in place for assessing rollover recommendations, and that they're documenting that assessment, making sure that you have a process in place for making the appropriate disclosures, and that you have a process for making sure that those disclosures are made on a timely basis, and that you're starting to get ready to start conducting retrospective reviews. Now, that all being said, and the similarities to Reg BI, this is a little bit different in that the PTE is really an exception to a prohibition. So failing to comply technically could cause a firm to not be able to take advantage of the exception. So where violations do occur, and as you're reviewing, it's important that firms, employ the self-correction requirements that the DOL put out. But I think early on, you're going to see an expectation of good faith efforts, but that doesn't mean that you should sort of take too much comfort in that, because eventually the examinations and the expectations are going to get higher. And so, in the second, third year, you're probably going to be seeing more in-depth reviews and higher expectations in terms of compliance with the requirements.
Thanks, Ed. Mitchell, I'm gonna shift the conversation to your area of expertise, and specifically, we've heard questions from our clients. There is a degree of ambiguity around the Department of Labor's investigative powers. Can you talk a little bit about this to our participants, webinar participants today? What can the Department of Labor do from an investigation perspective? Do they have enforcement capabilities? I'll leave it there for you.
Okay, sure. So as a technical matter, the department has the authority to investigate where they think that there has been a violation of law. And if you study the guidance and look backward in time, even to the guidance that was ultimately overturned by the Fifth Circuit in 2018, it is clear that the Department of Labor believes that there are certain types of practices, particularly the manner in which investment advisors compensate themselves and the fiduciary advice in the advice that they give, that create a status of fiduciary for the investment advisor, and that but for satisfying the exemption, there is going to be what's called a prohibited transaction and hence a violation of law. What typically happens in practice, if there is an investigation, one can expect to see anything from a letter from the Department of Labor asking some questions. We've had some clients in the past year get DOL letters. It's not a formal investigation, all the way up to a subpoena. And a subpoena, in my experience at least, typically is direct, is broad, and asks for quite a bit of in-depth information. So you might expect to see with a subpoena power, if it's exercised, asking for those, just what Ed was mentioning, policies and procedures, what are any written materials regarding training, retroactive reports, reviews, et cetera, and so forth. So it's very broad power. I think it to a certain extent, it's going to depend upon the way it's wielded is going to depend upon the evolution of how this rule plays out, but also depend upon the particular circumstances. For example, if the DOL finds good faith, if we're talking about foot faults, one might expect not to see a subpoena, whereas if there is just not a good faith attempt to comply with the rules, or if it seems that investment advice, or at least advice given to a client, falls within the concept of what the DOL thinks is investment advice, and there has been little or no effort to, in good faith, to satisfy the requirements of the exemption, then you may very well see a subpoena. And once you see a subpoena, it's not a choice as to whether you're going to answer it or not. It really is something that must be that is the subject of a demand, essentially.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that, Mitchell. And Craig, let me, you've got a slightly different perspective or lens into these requirements, obviously, sort of from a firm's perspective. How do you balance completely different sort of requirements between, I shouldn't say completely different requirements, or balancing requirements between the SEC's Reg BI requirements and then the Department of Labor's PTE 2020-02 requirements? Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And it brings up a real challenge for firms, because normally the way that our regulatory regime is laid out is we have 16 different federal regulators and a number of different state regulators. Normally, regulation is by industry type. So we have insurance regulators at the state level. We have FINRA regulating BDs. We have the SEC regulating investment companies and investment advisors. We have the CFTC and so forth. Those are all, I call them parallel. There is one regulator that regulates by account type, and that is perpendicular. It cuts across all the others. And that's the Department of Labor. They regulate by account type. And so they cut across virtually all of the other regulators who do retirement accounts and have retirement investors. So you asked a really good question. How do we manage that? Well, I think when managing overlapping regulations, as with the DOL, which inevitably overlaps just about all other regulations that we have by industry type, you just have to do your best to try to consolidate and harmonize whenever possible. I will say that for the most part, the DOL has not made it easy to do either. They kind of have their own way of doing things. If you read the adopting release, they intentionally did not harmonize with SEC rules. The one area where they did was in the impartial conduct standards and the best interest standard, right? But most everything else, we're seeing challenges because basically the DOL is dictating in a prescriptive way that we need to do things that we're not accustomed to doing, that we've never done before. And so that, I think, is the main challenge.
I think this is a great segue into the focus of today's conversation, which is surrounding retrospective review requirements and what folks in the industry and our clients are sort of wrestling with at the moment. David, if I can kind of bring you back into the conversation, we've talked a lot about a term that you've introduced to me, which is regulatory archaeology. In light of these retrospective review requirements, how important will documentation of those investor disclosures, the best interest disclosures, be in this new under this new regime?
Thanks, Parma. Let me first put some context around the circumstances in which I introduced that into the zeitgeist. The perspective I have as a litigator is when clients say, whether it's a suitability review or best interest review or PTE 2020-02 style review, when you're looking at this in real time and things are being tick and tied from a documentation standpoint and capturing the information and sending it out to the clients as it's supposed to be, right? The system's working as it's intended. If, however, the documentation is not as thorough as it could be, particularly under Reg BI, documentation isn't required in all instances. It's risk-based. Trying to undertake a retrospective annual review, as we've learned on the broker-dealer side, because DOL made explicit reference to the broker-dealer rules for annual reviews for broker-dealers, in particular, 3130, 3120, I believe, from an analogy standpoint. It becomes very difficult to undertake to certify the adequacy of your procedures and processes if you haven't been overseeing and reviewing the documentation as it's collected. And I have referenced archaeology. We're only talking about an annual retrospective, but imagine, if you will, a regulator comes in conducting an examination, an enforcement investigation, and they say, we want to look back over the last several years at these types of transactions involving these kinds of products to these kinds of clients. And so they've isolated 5,000, 10,000 different transactions. And you're trying to reconstruct for them that you have pretty effective policies and procedures, and the output of the effectiveness of your policies, whether it's for PTE purposes or BI, is the underlying documentation showing that it was being captured in real time. The last thing you want to be doing is excavating, right? Having to go into your email server in order to find things to say, I know we did a review of this transaction in real time, and I think we just sort of did a handwritten note to the file, which we put into CRM, which is pretty good, but it's not as nimble as some of the other systems or places that we capture documents, or we have to go to the branch and haul this out of a file drawer in hard copy. And so that's kind of the reference to excavation and archaeology and these sort of dirt digging kind of concepts into an annual retrospective review to say, look, make it easy on yourself. And so borrowing the pages from how it is that you do the annual review, broker dealers currently do, and if you're not a broker dealer but have otherwise annual review processes, thinking about the quality of the documentation output and the more frequent auditing and testing that you do on a periodic basis, on a less than annual basis, to determine the adequacy of your documentation practices now, so that it rolls forward and makes your annual review at the end of the day and the certification associated with it simpler.
Fantastic. There you have it, folks. Regulatory archaeology introduced into the compliance community. I don't know if you want to call it the Merriam-Webster dictionary. That might be a little bit too far. Ed, if I can shift the conversation to you and ask you about sort of how can these policies and procedures be augmented with a consistent and repeatable process?
Well, first, I think I'm going to start dressing up like Indiana Jones now that I know that I'm an archaeologist. So appreciate that, David. But no, I think that's right. And it kind of, we talked about, the sort of the first step, having reasonably designed policies and procedures. For sure, that's the starting point. But that only gets you part of the way there, where it really becomes important, but also where it really becomes tricky is in the implementation of those policies and procedures. And, in talking to compliance professionals, I often hear they say, well, everything would be just fine if we just followed our policies and procedures, and it's that would be great, but it's really difficult. And, we're going to talk a little bit just about the general regulatory environment these days, but it can be very difficult for people in the field with all these new rules and regulations. We talked about Reg BI and, the DOL's PTE. Those are just two of several very significant changes that have happened recently. And you're putting all of these requirements onto your field force, and they're expected to implement this. And so it can become very challenging. And the more challenging it becomes, the more difficult it is to get the intended outcomes that you're looking for from a compliance perspective. Craig had mentioned this. I think some of the things that you can really think about in order to aid in the implementation is to not overcomplicate the process. You know, what you really want to do is to create a process that drives the results that you're looking for. So, you know, to the point that David was making with respect to having manual processes and manual forms and the like, you know, if you just simply have a text box that says, explain why this rollover is in your client's best interest, you're less likely to get the results that you're looking for than if you have a step-by-step process that kind of drives them to provide the information that you're looking for about how to conduct and how to capture the analysis. And it's also important to, you know, not just rely on the retrospective review, but have a way to monitor and test your implementation throughout. Some way to highlight red flags where you have to intervene and identify, you know, where things might be breaking down and how you can go about that. But I think designing your policies and procedures, not just from the perspective of what do the rules require and what do we need to be doing, but thinking about how can we effectively do this in a way that we can drive the results that we're looking for, and make sure that we're getting the consistency across all of our representatives. So you don't have certain advisors who are providing you, you know, one level of quality and others providing, you know, a separate level of quality, really kind of helping making sure that you get that consistency.
Thank you, Ed. Mitchell, I saw your hand go up. Any thoughts on this?
Well, I was going to ask a question of Ed and possibly of Craig, and it was something that Ed just touched on, which is that, yes, there's the retroactive review requirement, but given the restrictions that apply to corrections, the timing of corrections and the feasibility of that, don't you want to, at least during the year, be setting up some sort of goalposts during the year? So maybe it's not the full retrospective review, but you are sampling or seeing if your portion of your requirements are actually being met in practice. And have you seen that happening?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the expectations of the DOL with respect to the PTE. I think it's the expectations of FINRA and the SEC when they talk about Reg BI, is that you're not waiting till you do your annual retrospective review to look back and see if there's any issues, that you're regularly monitoring and looking for potential breakdowns and that you're addressing them when they come up, both in terms of just to make sure that you're, you know, meeting the requirements in this case of the exemption. But, you know, to your point, you know, if you're going to meet the requirements of the exemption, if there are issues that come up, you know, you need to take advantage of the self-correction. You have to do that within the timeframes required. So the expectation is that you're reviewing that regularly. So, you know, I was interested in the poll results that said, you know, the breakdown between people who are leveraging technology versus manual processes, and the rule doesn't require one or the other, but it becomes really difficult to monitor and look for potential red flags if you're using a manual process. It doesn't mean that you can't do that, but then you have to rely on things like sampling to look to see if there's any potential issues. Where if you're using technology, you might be able to have ways to identify particular issues or patterns or things that you need to follow up on a more real-time basis.
Yeah, if I can throw in something on that, Param, just to the point of testing and sampling methodology, but also this tension between, you know, reliance on technology and over reliance on technology. You know, we've seen cases come out of FINRA in recent years where there had been, you know, criticism of firms where, you know, they were attempting to do things on a manual basis and the volume just got too great. And so it became this issue of saying, look, you know, it's part of a system of reasonable supervision to implement processes that enable you to review and approve transactions as they work their way through the system. And so, you know, whether and to what extent your firm has sort of reached a tipping point where just quantitatively it can't do enough reviewing manually. By the same token, there's always the danger of an over-reliance. We've seen cases as well on the other side of that spectrum where you had a sort of a fire and forget it kind of system in place of, look, we put in these parameters to flag exceptions or red flags for us if we needed to review it. and we didn't get any flags. And the point would be as well, you still need to check the checking, right? What's the quality of the exception reporting to at least flag things for you in the first instance, and you can't just sort of overly rely upon the technology without the human interface to say, okay, fine, I got it. I need to have a follow-up based upon these exceptions that are coming out. And when we're doing our audits, periodic retrospective review to look back at, let's say, the last quarter of transactions, how is that being escalated? How are they being followed up? So it's an effective system is using the tools to help you manage the quantity, but then having the right human interface to analyze that and then escalate and then act upon and enhance, and maybe we need some more training and maybe we need to tweak our form. I mean, those are all sort of human, manual, laborious tasks, and you can't necessarily get rid of them just with the tool. So it's always a blended approach.
Yeah. If I just may also add, we're at the beginning here in a sense, rather than in the middle and toward the end. And so some of this should be thought of as what one does now over the next year or two. And while we were talking internally, I'm trying to remember who was mentioning it, that we are all going to have to monitor what is feasible and possibly the Department of Labor's reaction to what is feasible.
I think to that point, Mitchell, the one thing that I noticed in the poll results is the reason behind leveraging manual processes versus technology seemed to be more of an issue of time and resources. So I think as time goes on, there might be, more of a shift to, using and leveraging more and more technology over time. But right now, people were just looking to what can we get set up right now to make sure we're complying with the rule, and then see how we can become more effective and efficient.
Right. And I wanted to add to that. I think another factor that maybe doesn't show up directly in the poll results has to do with regulatory uncertainty. This feeling of deja vu. We all remember 2016 and what happened in 2018, right? And we know that there have been 2 challenges in court to the current iteration of the DOL rule. Might this be vacated again? No one knows. And I think with that uncertainty, one would be, I think, certainly well advised to consider that when looking at a significant outlay in technology or systems for something that could be potentially vacated again in a year or two.
I love this balanced conversation. I'm going to take a quick minute to do a little bit of a commercial break. I think given the conversation around adopting technology versus not, in case you're following InvestorCOM on your social media platforms minus Instagram, today we announced a new dashboard capability to add to our end-to-end rollover analyzer application, which you may have been aware of. With this new feature, compliance and supervisory teams will be able to access and assess all rollover activity and product recommendations across your firm. So specifically, given the topic of conversation today, we're talking about monitoring volumes of rollover data, drilling into specific potentially problematic areas, really leveraging a risk-based scenario approach of finding remedies to potential challenges. Obviously, with any type of data analysis framework, you'll have the capability of delivering any of these data and analytical reports directly to specific personnel compliance teams across your firm.
Can I ask a question on that?
Please.
You have, by way of example, unfavorable recommendations. Does that mean where the analyzer has determined that it's not in the person's best interest for what we're recommending?
So we've got one of the beauties of our, obviously I'm biased, but one of the specific features of our application is to be able to configure specific flags across the firm. So for example, if that cost to service value proposition or fit value proposition is, let's just say, beyond a particular breach, beyond a particular data point, then we can flag it as an unfavorable rollover recommendation for firms to be able to flag it and effectively scope it out and say, hey, the data, to your point, David, don't just rely on the data, let the dashboard flag that for you to be able to kind of dig further if possible.
Yeah, because just to seize on that, one of the things I hear time and again from firms who are being examined is the question comes out of, okay, well, how many recommendations did you either not make, insofar as we decided it was better for the person to stay in the plan. We recommended against a rollover in this particular instance. How did you document that? And so I think sometimes firms have struggled with saying, well, we certainly capture the bases and the documentation when we do recommend the course of action, which is all the analysis we've been discussing. But when you're saying, just stay where you are, how well of a job do you do that? And then this kind of comes up again with Reg BI as well, where you're saying, well, how many transactions did you reject? Like, that's the question you get from examiners is, how many did you reject? It's like, well, it's not necessarily rejecting. And there's a 3-part analysis to explain why the negative treatment of something isn't documented the same way, but it is the way examiners look at things, in a sense of, how do we know how well your system is working unless we can see the instances in which you decided against a course of action? If 100% of the time you recommend that people roll over, well, then it certainly sounds like your system is tilted towards encouraging rollovers. So I just throw that out there in terms of both the documentation issue we're talking about, the auditing issue, but really going into the meat of when examiners ask questions. The tough one is how many instances did you say no?
Absolutely. And I'll add one thing from the perspective of having helped a number of firms adopt technology. David, that specific point, in my opinion, is where technology can actually be an asset. Obviously putting the specific application aside, the interpretation of the regulation is every single recommendation has to be delivered to the investor, not execution, but recommendation. So there is this multiplier effect, if you kind of think about that conceptually, between there could be 5 recommendations, a client will say yes to one of those recommendations. So I think digitizing this application, digitizing this process across your firm will only give you an upper hand to be able to say, hey, look, I've made 5,000 recommendations across my firm, but to maybe Craig's point earlier on, only 1,000 of those were executed and accounts were open as a result of the rollover recommendation. So I think those are where you can actually leverage data to help you as an asset. Now, folks, let me sort of bring this back to the topic at hand. And before I jump back into retrospective review requirements, always inviting our audience here to ask our panelists questions. We're going to take them up in a short few minutes. So please leverage that opportunity. I've seen some questions come in, trickle in through the time here. Craig, I know you've written a ton about this. Maybe I can ask you for a high-level summary, if possible, of this retrospective review requirements. Any sort of sound bites or specific advice you'd have for our audience today?
Well, I'll make it real simple. Thank you. As part of this presentation, there are a couple of handouts. One is an article that is right on point with regard to the retrospective reviews. And the second, I think many firms are going to find very helpful, which is the retirement accounts and ERISA testing template. And I think those 2 handouts speak for themselves, but I would say note to self, make sure that you download those and check those out.
Definitely. I've read through them. They're definitely on point, and we certainly welcome you to engage with them. Now, so one specific question in mind has kind of come about quite a bit, and maybe Craig, I can kind of pick on you again. Are there any specific record-keeping requirements with respect to this retrospective review requirement?
Yes, there are. And I think what's interesting to note is that the DOL's record-keeping requirements for records under PTE 2020-02 does not conform with either the FINRA broker-dealer record-keeping rules or the SEC investment advisor record-keeping rules. They require under the DOL 6 years retention requirement, and all information must be available upon request within 10 days.
And specifically to this particular point, there's been a lot of questions about when an error or omission is identified, folks, can you help our audience identify what the specific steps will need to be for a compliance officer at a firm?
Yeah, actually, I'll take that one again. So I think what's important is whenever doing a review, and it could be PT 2020-02 or anything else that we do in compliance, there are typically three areas where violations can occur. One is in the policy and procedure design. You can have gaps. That's a real common one. And so I think that when undertaking this retrospective review under PT 2020-02, I would start with your policies and procedures, and don't just assume that they're good. You know, you need to actually think them through now with a little bit of experience, make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. And with this rule, I think that's particularly important. I made some specific comments within the article. The second area where violations can occur is the policies and procedures weren't properly implemented and there wasn't adequate training. Okay, and that's also really common. The third area that you can see violations is in execution. And that's where the errors and omissions, I think, particularly come in. You know, maybe you had a policy and a procedure, maybe it was implemented, trained, but whomever in your field force just didn't enter the information into the software or didn't complete what they were supposed to complete. That's an error of omission. Those kinds of things are really difficult to detect. And that's why if you look at the article and if you look at the testing template, there are specific steps that you can take through sampling to try to detect errors of omission. An instance where, well, in this scenario, you know, the advisor should have done this, but it wasn't done. So I think, you know, again, pay attention to that because those are some of the most difficult errors to detect.
And that's very important in terms of, you know, the area that Mitchell had talked about before, which is the self-correction requirements and understanding when you need to undertake that self-correction in order to make sure you can continue to rely on the exemption. So, you know, to the extent that you identify issues, you know, in terms of the execution, then also making sure that you take a look to see, you know, is this something that we need to address through the self-correction policy, which there is a reporting requirement out to the DOL, and making sure that, you know, in those circumstances where that's appropriate, that you're doing that. The question comes down to when is it appropriate, you know, to invoke that. And I think it's a little bit unclear right now. And I've heard a lot of different thoughts in terms of that. And, you know, I think taking a reasonable approach is the best way to do it. And then as we get more guidance coming out of the DOL, I think that'll be helpful in terms of understanding when is it that you need to officially invoke the self-correction policy when there might be a foot fault.
Right, and there are all sorts of uncertain questions and answers still surrounding this. Like, for example, if you have many very small errors, how do you what do those accumulate and put you in one posture? For example, there's a requirement to make the investor whole. If you can make the investor whole, well, it's sort of hard to. It's impossible actually to take an IRA rollover and put it back into a 401k plan. That is the big one of the big problems here. And so what happens is you run into, when you're thinking about corrections and just picking up on your point, Ed, sort of that it is going to be very fact specific in terms of it's just going to be a different answer depending upon the circumstances. And I know that sounds wishy-washy, but unfortunately it is. And you're going to have to, in some sense, do the best you can.
Love it. I love the insights that you're all sharing. And I think so our audience, given the kind of questions that are floating in here today, just before we jump into the questions, one final question, and Craig, this sort of goes back to the conversation we had during our prep for today's meeting. And are there any lessons or key learnings from our recent Reg BI enforcement activity through the SEC and FINRA?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I think there absolutely is. clearly the SEC, when drafting Reg BI in 2020, was very much influenced by the DOL, even though at that time the BICE, the BICE, had already been vacated in 2018. So we see a lot of similarities, and I think we can kind of take a clue from the way that the SEC and now FINRA have been enforcing Reg BI. In terms of, we can take a clue in terms of how we might anticipate enforcement of PTE 2020-02. And in particular, my firm is a dual registrant, so we are a broker-dealer subject to Reg BI. And we implemented Reg BI in 2020 after the enforcement action against Western International came out in June. We examined that carefully, and we went back to our policies and procedures. We felt they were fine. We looked at our workflows. We felt that they were fine. What we decided to do, based on some of the findings in the Western International case, is we did a retraining on Reg BI. And in particular, our forms, like many companies, required the registered representative to write a free form response as to why the recommendation was in the best interest of the investor. Really common among small firms, right? Firms also do that for PTE 2020-02. Why we did the retraining was the enforcement action against Western cited 8 specific client examples. And in all 8, the SEC cited the rationale as being a deficiency. And I read those and I thought, oh, I probably would have approved that. And because, here, let me give you an example. One of the rationales cited in the SEC enforcement action against Western was client wanted a higher interest rate than they could earn in the bank. Okay, that's a rationale, and I like I said, I would have accepted that. I would have approved it if I was a supervisor. SEC cited it as a deficiency, saying that that was a reason why the transaction was done, not a reason why the transaction is in the best interest of the investor. So what we did is we did a retraining. We came up with a number of examples as to why, the free-form rationales needed to be more carefully written, specifically to address best interest of the investor. So that was a takeaway that we had on Reg BI. We also did that for PTE 2020-02. So it served both purposes. And I think that's something that is in the article and the testing template. There's a specific question in the testing template regarding the rationale for why it's in the best interest.
Craig, if I
Craig.
can, I'm sorry, go ahead, Phil. Go ahead, Mitch.
Please, David, I'll go after you.
Just on that point, we've worked with a number of firms and working with them on their forms. And I think the sea change as both BI and PTE 2020-02 should be forcing firms to consider is what the firm collects as part of the ordinary course of business of saying, okay, what are you trying to do? What are you looking to achieve? What do you like? What do you not like? Those are all important factors, but they're only one part of the equation. And I see it as a subjective versus an objective type of analysis. And what I mean by that is from the perspective of the firm, you need to be able to say subjectively, we as the firm and I as the registered representative or the investment advisor representative believe that the recommendation I'm making here really is their best interest. There could be a circumstance where a person says, I want to do A, B, and C, and we write those down. Client wanted, like you just said, Craig, client wanted better interest than they were getting in the bank. But all of the other economic and suitability type factor they gave you tells you that notwithstanding what they're trying to do, we subjectively believe this course of action is not the right one for them. Maybe a different one is. And so this is where I think the final analysis and let's say the certification as well as the bases of the recommendation at the back end, as you work your way through the form, you should be collecting both sort of tidbits from people of what is the person trying to achieve. That's stuff that all of the advisors know how to do. They've been doing it for decades. They know how to elicit that information, but understanding that the expectation here is that this has to be why you and the firm think this course of action is in their best interest. And it may not always align with what the person says that they want, or hopefully it's okay, they want to do A, B, and C, but we're recommending X. And we subjectively believe X is the best interest for the person. I think that's where this comes down to compressing these concepts, is saying you have to have undertaken your own review, not just sort of accepting the statement from the client of I want X. And I've seen way too many freeform narratives that just say client wanted X, that's why we're recommending it. It's like, well, that's to what Craig just said. He cited from the case. Just because the client wanted that, that doesn't mean that that's what's the firm thinks is in the client's best interest. What is that analysis?
Love it. Mitchell?
I was just going to say, and just picking up right where David just left off, and a question for Craig. So what, going back in that retraining and redrafting that statement as to what is in the best interest, what does that then look like in comparison to what it originally looked like?
Well, I think it, like I said, we didn't feel there was any issues with our policies and procedures. We didn't feel that there were any issues with our workflows and the forms that we created. What we felt needed to be improved was just better execution. And because our policies required a free-form response, which, as David mentioned, is subjective, we just needed to train so that they could better understand what needs to come out in that subjective rationale.
That's what I was asking. What is that rationale? Just an example. What in your scenario with the guy wants or the woman wants a higher interest rate? What does that say then? If it's in their best interest, does it say, well, it's because obviously they earn more money? Is it because it's the quality of the issuer? Is it because it fits with their diversified portfolio? Is it a set of factors that are predetermined? What does that look like?
Well, unfortunately, there is no scripted type pathway or response. And I think all the factors that you mentioned go right to best interest, and that's what we're looking for. And that's what we trained on. So I think, as David mentioned, the big difference was not why you did the transaction, but why the transaction is in the best interest. And so I know, and the DOL stayed very high level, principles based. They didn't prescriptively say, this is what you have to do to document best interest. They didn't even define best interest, right? So they left it extremely high level. And to some extent, we kind of did that at the firm level as well, just so that it could be broad enough to encompass a lot of different myriad of scenarios, without having gaps. But we felt that through the training, we could accomplish the goal of getting those rationales to be more in line with what we and what the regulators are looking for.
And the DOL did identify in the preamble, as well as their FAQs, some of the considerations to think about when doing the analysis. So, in addition from starting to, why this transaction, why does a customer want to do it, but then also factoring in those other considerations like the differences between the costs, the differences in the level of services, the products that are available, any potential impact that it might have in terms of things like required distributions, those kind of things. Those types of are the kind of things that I think they would expect to be part of that analysis, and that those are the kind of things that, because it's part of the analysis, that you'd want to consider documenting, and whether that's through sort of a step-by-step process or through a free-form narrative that's supported by training. You want to make sure that that's the kind of stuff that you're collecting.
What I've seen firms do, and this kind of ties back into the InvestorCOM theme, but is having a series of questions designed to elicit background information, which, coming to the end of the form, will then parrot, a form of checkbox that the advisor can say, well, I already answered this question above when I elicited information from the client about whether or not they have a need for integrated investment management, because they told me that they had multiple accounts. So now that I have a questionnaire that's designed in different categories, It enables me to say, because more often than not, the costs economically of staying in the plan versus the cost of rolling out of the plan are probably, it's going to cost them somewhat more, may or may not. But let's assume more often than not that may be the case when you get the Form 5500 or the 404A5. And so what you're really saying is, what is the package of services that I have to offer and that this person is looking for that would be consistent with what this person's best interest? Yes, there's an inherent conflict that, that I will make money from this. That's fully disclosed. But I need to have profiled this person, that this person has a need for a variety of services. This isn't just they wanted more securities, because they've specifically said that's not a good justification. But what's the total package of services that this person needs? So it's more integrated investment management. That they need help in managing their investments relative to their stated investment objectives for the account. They need help monitoring their investments, more so professional money management in a way with than the services they may be receiving in the plan. But it's that level of kind of tech checkbox that can be helpful if you're not happy with the output that you're getting from the freeform narrative. So it's kind of what questions I'm asking up front that lead me to a certain path or workflow of the services that we have to offer, and that this person may be benefited by my recommending that they use those in rolling over.
Thank you, David. Okay, so if I could piggyback off of your point there, David, and the discussion throughout, and sort of do a quick lightning round of questions, so folks get come off mute, if I could, to our panel, ask our panelists to come off mute. So I think some of these questions we've touched on today, but just to be respectful of our audience, for a firm that does a pre-transaction approval of all rollover recommendations, including IRA to IRA transfers, are there any specific red flags, particularly that need to be sampled or gleaned?
From the IRA provider perspective or from the investor perspective?
This is more from a retrospective review requirement perspective. As far as I understand the question, specifically the nuance here is that this particular firm approves all rollover recommendations, including IRA to IRA transfers. Is there any specific red flag that this person in compliance or legal needs to vet for?
I would say even though you're doing a trade by trade review or a recommendation by recommendation review, which is a good process, you want to take a step back and look for patterns, right? So you want to see patterns where if every time, to David's point earlier, if every time you're confronted with an assessment, you always recommend the rollover. You want to look into that to make sure that all those recommendations were appropriate, that you have the right documentation and the rationale behind it seems reasonable, right? So you want to take a look into those patterns. If you're seeing patterns where the cost is always in the best interest to stay with the plan, and you're recommending the rollover to the IRA, doesn't necessarily mean, to David's point about there could be reasons for that, but you want to look deeper into that and make sure that you're assessing that. So I think you just want to take a step back and look for potential patterns where there might be some needles in the haystack that you want to follow up on.
Love it. Thank you, Ed. Go ahead, Craig.
Yeah, I was going to say, in the article, I addressed sampling and the different sampling methodologies. And I think to answer that question, you would need to understand the risks entailed at your firm. So for example, if you had one advisor that liked to do rollovers into high commission variable annuities or illiquid alts, that, something like that, higher risk type transactions, you might want to use a judgmental sampling methodology and sample many more of those types of transactions than maybe, transactions where someone is doing a rollover and the portfolio is going to be invested in short-term US Treasuries, that are relatively lower risk. So it's a matter of understanding the business and then choosing an appropriate sampling methodology.
Love it. Okay, one more. Sorry, Mitch, just one more question. This might actually come to you specifically because I think you touched on it. With respect to the self-reporting part of the retrospective review requirements, there's a need to correct and then make the client whole, as you said. there seems to be a lack of clarity on what qualifies as correcting or what is considered to be an investment loss. Any insights on how this, if this were to ever come across a compliance officer's desk, how they could potentially address it or remedy it?
I think, unfortunately, that there is not a good answer at this point to that question, or that there may be many answers, all of them approximations of a good answer. And the reason is you can go through myriad fact patterns, but let's, for example, imagine that the initial recommendation to roll over was faulty. Well, then how do you calculate loss? Is every single loss and then after that recommendation, there are no further recommendations? How do you measure losses in the account from that point forward? Or, for example, let's suppose that you, as I think Craig was alluding to in execution, you didn't, you had done the training, you had done your policies and procedures, but you didn't spit out and deliver the conflict of interest information, and someone comes back and says, well, if I had known about that, I might not have invested. Well, where do you start the timing on that? And I just don't, for my purposes, maybe the other panelists do, I just don't see enough guidance to sink one's teeth into. I think one can analogize, one can see what's happening so far with best interest, or one can imagine. There are clear-cut cases, obviously, where you recommend investing in X and it was not in the client's best interest and it's a loss, and you make up the loss. But there are a lot of very hard questions and permutations, and I just don't think there's an answer to that's good at this point. I'd like to leave on a positive note, but that's what I think.
I think if I could just squeeze, I know we're just over time. One final question, and I think it's a good one worth sharing with our audience, and it's around, have you heard of any firms or received any DOL letters or subpoenas specific to PTE 2020-02? Have any of those been rolling out? Anybody? No?
Nothing yet.
All right. Certainly an easy one to address.
I would say this, though, and this kind of goes to the structure of where you put your retrospective review. And what by that I mean, if you have a separate report that you put together for purposes of the certification process, fine. If you roll it in as a dual IABD, you roll it into just another section to your annual review for purposes of the BD. You're subjecting that to regulator scrutiny on the BD side. So not saying, so again, it kind of goes to the issues Craig was talking about before about how do you deal with sort of these multiple vectors of different regulators looking at your stuff. And one way for the purposes of the annual retrospective review is hive it off, make it its own report so that the BD annual review that you're preparing for 3120, 3130 purposes is a separate document for purposes of the annual retrospective review prepared for DOL PTE 2020-02.
That makes a lot of sense.
Folks, thank you very much for your time. To our panelists, always great to have a conversation with you. And as you can see, time certainly does fly. Really appreciate your time. If we didn't answer any of your questions, we've grouped them together. We'll look at them, review them, and certainly do our best to follow up with you as soon as possible. As always, thank you for your time. We'll be following up with you with the presentation today, the slides, along with Mr. Watanabe's wonderful artifacts. Thank you all for your time.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.